She was 21, and for all intents and purposes, homeless. Her guardian, a man who was her uncle in name only, had dispatched her to a crumbling manor in Derbyshire, a place called Corvin Hall, under the guise of charity. He had called it a caretaking position, a chance for her to be of use. But Mary Prescott understood its true nature. It was a place to be sent when you were no longer convenient, a quiet and genteel form of disposal. She had arrived with a single trunk, a small purse containing 11 pounds and 4 shillings, and the clothes she stood up in. The house was a monument to neglect, a great stone shell hollowed out by damp and time. But what her guardian did not know, what no one in the nearby village of Aldwych knew, was that within the house was a sealed north wing, locked and bolted since the year 1832. And it had not been sealed because it was empty, but because it was full. It held a secret kept for 40 years, waiting for someone with nothing left to lose and the patience to look closer. If you have ever felt overlooked, or have found value where others saw only ruin, then settle in and stay close. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from, as we tell the story of Mary Prescott and the inheritance she found behind a forgotten door. This story begins not with the house, but with the skills that would allow a young woman to reclaim it. It begins with the quiet competence that is so often forged in the absence of affection, a resilience built not for grand battles, but for the slow, wearing friction of daily life. Mary was a creature of such resilience, shaped by a childhood of careful observation and quiet work in the house of a man who never once looked at her with warmth. Mary Prescott's life had been cleaved in two by the time she was 7. The first part was a brief, sunlit memory of her parents' modest home in Kent, a place filled with the scent of her mother's baking and the low murmur of her father's voice as he read in the evenings. Her father, a kind man with ink-stained fingers, had been a clerk for a shipping firm, and her mother a woman whose hands were never still, always mending or gardening or pressing flowers between the pages of a book. That life ended with a fever that swept through their parish in the winter of 1828, taking them both within a week of each other. The second part of her life began when her mother's brother, Mr. Elias Thorne, a prosperous merchant with no children of his own, took her into his London household on Cavendish Square. It was not a home, it was a residence, a place of polished mahogany and silent servants, where affection was treated as a kind of disorder. Mr. Thorne provided for her physical needs with the grim efficiency of a man settling a debt. He paid for her clothes, her food, and a tutor for 2 hours a day, but he offered nothing of himself. He was a creature of the city, of ledgers and contracts, and he did not know what to do with a quiet, grieving child. So he ignored her. Mary learned to make herself small, to move through the grand house like a shadow, her presence marked only by the faintest whisper of her skirts on the Turkey carpets. Her true education came not from the paid tutor, but from the household's formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. A widow in her late 50s, Mrs. Gable was a woman of immense capability and few words. She saw in Mary not a burden, but a pair of willing hands and a watchful eye. She took the girl under her wing, teaching her the intricate arts of household management. From Mrs. Gable, Mary learned to take an inventory, to keep accounts, to air linens properly, and to make soap from lye and tallow. She learned how to patch a sheet so finely the mend was nearly invisible, how to blacken a grate, how to make a nourishing soup from scraps, and how to tell good salt pork from bad. More than that, she learned the deep satisfaction of patient, methodical work. Mrs. Gable taught her that to restore order to a room was to restore a small piece of order to the world. She taught her that value was not always obvious, that a worn blanket could be rewoven, a chipped cup could still hold water, and a neglected corner, with enough soap and effort, could be made clean and bright again. Throughout these years, Mary kept one single treasure from her former life, a small, plain silver locket on a delicate chain, a gift from her mother. It was thin and worn smooth from her constant touch. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, exquisitely painted watercolor miniature of her father, his kind eyes looking out at her. On the other side was a tightly folded lock of her mother's pale brown hair. It was the only object she possessed that was given in love, and she wore it always, tucked beneath the high collar of her dress, a cool, constant weight against her skin. It was a private reminder of a world where she had been cherished, a world before she became an inconvenience. Her practical skills and her locket were the two things she would carry with her out of that house, the tools and the talisman for the life that was to come. The end of her time in Cavendish Square came not with a shout, but with the dry rustle of paper. On the morning of her 21st birthday, Mary was summoned to her uncle's study, a room she had entered perhaps a dozen times in 14 years. Mr. Thorne was there, standing stiffly by the fireplace, and with him was his solicitor, a thin, pale man named Mr. Davies, who smelled of dust and sealing wax. The solicitor cleared his throat and began to speak in a flat, dispassionate tone. He explained that upon reaching her majority, the modest trust her father had left for her upkeep was now exhausted. Her uncle, he continued, had most generously fulfilled his familial duty, but that duty was now concluded. Mary stood before them, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her expression calm. She had been expecting this day for years, had rehearsed it in the quiet of her small attic room. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching a scene in a play. Mr. Thorne finally spoke, his voice as cold and hard as the coins he counted in his office. "I have found a situation for you, Mary," he said, not looking at her, but at a point on the wall just over her head. "It is a family property in Derbyshire, Corvin Hall. It has stood empty for some years. It requires a caretaker, someone to live in it, to see that it does not fall completely to ruin." He made it sound like an act of profound generosity, a respectable position offered to a poor relation. But Mary understood the words. He did not say. The house was remote, isolated. The position was unpaid. There would be no one to oversee her, no one to care if she thrived or failed. It was an exile. "You will be provided with a small stipend for your journey and for initial provisions," Mr. Davies added, consulting his papers. £11, 4 shillings. It will be sufficient." Mary inclined her head. "Thank you, Uncle. You have been very kind." The words were polite, correct, and utterly devoid of the feeling he neither expected nor deserved. She did not plead or weep. To do so would have been to give him the satisfaction of her distress, and she would not grant him that. She had learned long ago from Mrs. Gable that dignity was a shield you carried on the inside. The interview was over. She was dismissed. She returned to her room and began to pack. It did not take long. Her possessions fit easily into a single sturdy trunk. 3 dresses of plain, dark wool, her underthings, her sewing kit, a few cherished books, and a small box containing her mother's locket, which she only removed at night. As she folded her last dress, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper entered and closed the door behind her. She looked at the trunk, then at Mary, her face a mask of stern composure that could not quite hide the sorrow in her eyes. She said nothing for a long moment. simply stood there, a solid, reassuring presence. Then she pressed a small, heavy cloth bag into Mary's hand. "This is from my own savings," she said, her voice low and firm. "There are 20 pounds here. Do not argue. A woman alone needs a reserve. You do not touch this unless you are in dire straits. It is for emergencies." Mary's throat tightened. She could not speak. She simply nodded, her fingers closing around the unexpected weight of the coins. It was the greatest kindness she had been shown in 14 years. Mrs. Gable then placed a hand on Mary's shoulder. "You have good hands and a good head on your shoulders, Mary Prescott," she said. "You see what needs doing and you do it. Remember what I taught you. Start with one corner, make it clean, then move to the next. That is how you reclaim a derelict house, and that is how you build a life." Mary finally found her voice. "I will not forget," she whispered, and that was their farewell. The following morning, a cab was called. Her trunk was loaded on top. Mr. Thorne did not come down to see her off. As the cab pulled away from the grand, unfeeling house, Mary did not look back. She looked forward, down the gray London street, toward a future that was utterly uncertain. Her hands resting on the worn leather of her lap, one clutching a small purse from her uncle, the other hidden in her pocket, clutching a much heavier one from a friend. The journey north was a slow unwinding of the world she had known. The first day was spent in the belly of a public coach, rattling over the cobbled streets of London and out into the sprawling suburbs. The city's grip loosened gradually, the tight rows of brick houses giving way to market towns, then to villages surrounded by the patchwork green of the home counties. Mary sat by the window, a silent observer, watching the landscape shift and change. The air itself seemed to alter, losing the city's perpetual haze of coal smoke and acquiring the damp, clean scent of earth and rain. Her fellow passengers were a mix of merchants, a farmer's wife, and a young soldier on leave. Their chatter a low hum against the rhythmic clatter of the wheels and the jingle of the harness. Mary spoke only when spoken to, offering polite, brief answers that discouraged further conversation. She was a self-contained figure in her plain gray dress and bonnet. Her thoughts turned inward. She spent 2 nights at coaching inns along the Great North Road, establishments bustling with the transient lives of travelers. The rooms were small and smelled of stale beer and beeswax, but the beds were clean enough, and Mary, exhausted from the day's constant motion, slept deeply. On the 3rd day, the landscape began to rise and fall in long, sweeping hills. Stone walls replaced hedgerows, and the trees grew darker and more windswept. They had reached Derbyshire. The coach deposited her, along with her trunk, in the market town of Bakewell. From there, she was told, the village of Aldwych was another 7 miles, and there was no regular service. She paid a man named Silas Croft, a carter with a weathered face and kind eyes, a few shillings to take her and her trunk the rest of the way. The cart was slow, pulled by a single plodding horse, and the journey took the better part of the afternoon. As they trundled along the narrow, muddy lanes, Silas pointed out landmarks with the quiet pride of a man who has never lived anywhere else. "That there's the old vicarage," he'd say, gesturing with his whip, "and beyond, the squire's land." He asked her purpose in coming to Aldwych, and when she told him she was to be the caretaker at Corvin Hall, his expression clouded over. "The old Prescott place?" he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Been empty since before I was a boy. They say it's a damp, sorrowful house." He fell silent after that, a respectful quiet that told Mary he understood her situation better than she might have guessed. He knew what it meant for a young woman to be sent alone to such a place. Finally, he pointed up a long, ascending track that branched off from the main lane. The entrance was flanked by two crumbling stone pillars, one of which had lost its cap. The drive beyond was a tunnel of overgrown rhododendrons and grasping briars. "This is it," he said, pulling the horse to a halt. "This is the way to Corvin Hall." He helped her down and unloaded her trunk, placing it at the edge of the drive. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of wet leaves and decay. Through a gap in the trees, she could see the house for the first time. It sat on a rise, a formidable silhouette of gray stone against a sky the color of slate. It was larger than she had imagined, with a steep, moss-covered roof and rows of dark, sightless windows. It did not look welcoming. It looked like a place that had been waiting a very long time. Mary paid Silas, thanking him for his help. He tipped his hat, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, with a look of plain pity. "God be with you, miss," he said, and then he turned his cart and rumbled back down the lane, leaving her alone at the foot of the drive with her single trunk and the great, silent house looming above. Mary stood for a long moment at the bottom of the overgrown drive, the silence broken only by the drip of water from the dense canopy of leaves overhead. The air was heavy, still, and cool, holding the particular chill of places long untouched by sunlight. She took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation filling her lungs. Then she bent, took one handle of her trunk, and began to drag it up the rutted track. It was heavy, and the ground was uneven, but she moved with a slow, determined rhythm. Her focus narrowed to the next few feet of ground. This was the first task. She would complete it. By the time she reached the graveled sweep before the house, her hands were raw, and her breath was coming in ragged bursts. She left the trunk near the great oak front door and stood back, her gaze traveling up the building's formidable facade. Silas Croft had called it a sorrowful house, and he was right. It was a place steeped in neglect. Gray and green lichens painted the Derbyshire stone in melancholy patterns. A thick mantle of ivy crept up one side, its tendrils prying at the mortar between the stones and obscuring the frames of the windows. Several slates had slipped from the roof, leaving dark, vulnerable gashes. The front door was immense, its oak planks bleached by weather and studded with rusted iron bolts. The key her uncle's solicitor had given her was equally large and ornate. It turned in the lock with a grating shriek of protest, the sound echoing in the profound silence. The door swung inward on complaining hinges, opening into a darkness that smelled of dust, trapped air, and the faint, sweet scent of rot. Light from the open doorway sliced through the gloom, illuminating a wide entrance hall. A grand staircase of dark, carved wood swept upwards into the shadows, its banister thick with a soft blanket of dust. Cobwebs, heavy as shrouds, hung from a high, plaster-ceilinged rose. To her left and right, doors leading to other rooms stood closed, their surfaces filmed with grime. Mary stepped inside, her footsteps unnervingly loud on the stone-flagged floor. She ran a gloved finger along a nearby console table, leaving a clean streak in the thick gray dust. This was her new home. This was her charge. She spent the rest of the daylight hours in a methodical exploration. She did not search for comforts, but for necessities. A water source, a sound roof, a defensible space against the cold and damp. She found the kitchens at the back of the house. A great cast-iron range stood cold and rusted. A stone sink was stained and dark. But a hand pump stood beside it, and after several minutes of hard, squealing work, It coughed up a gout of reddish water, which eventually ran clear and cold. This was a victory. She found a small pantry with shelves, empty save for the droppings of mice. Upstairs, she moved from one bedchamber to the next, each one a tableau of decay. Furniture stood draped in dust sheets, ghostly shapes in the gloom. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, curling strips, revealing the damp, stained plaster beneath. But in a small servant's room at the very back of the house, overlooking what was once a kitchen garden, she found a space that felt manageable. It had a small fireplace, a simple iron bedstead, and a window whose glass was intact. The roof directly above seemed sound. This would be her corner. She would make this one room clean. As she made her way back to the main hall, her tour of inspection complete, she came to the north wing. It was separated from the rest of the house by a heavy oak door, thicker and more formidable than the others. It was not merely closed, it was sealed. Two heavy iron bolts, rusted into their sockets, were drawn across it on her side. A large, old-fashioned lock was set into the wood, its keyhole plugged tight with a hard, yellowed wax. A film of undisturbed dust, thicker here than anywhere else, lay over the door, the bolts, and the floor before it. It was clear that no one had passed this way for a very long time. A date had been scratched into the wood just above the lock. 1832, 40 years. She placed her hand on the cold, rough wood. There was no sound from beyond, no draft. It was a place apart, a sealed chamber within the dying house. Her uncle had not mentioned it. The solicitor's inventory of the property had listed it simply as North Wing, unused. But Mary, standing in the deepening twilight of the hall, felt a prickle of curiosity. It was not fear. It was a quiet, insistent question. Why would someone go to such trouble to seal a door from the outside? What were they so determined to keep in or to keep out? For the first 2 weeks, Mary ignored the sealed door. Her life was a constant, consuming cycle of labor. She followed Mrs. Gable's advice to the letter. She started with one corner. Her chosen room at the back of the house became her entire world. She dragged her trunk up the back stairs and began the slow, arduous process of reclamation. She swept down the cobwebs, scrubbed the floorboards with cold water and the small bar of lye soap she had brought, and washed the single window until the watery afternoon light could filter through. She found a tinderbox and flint in the kitchen, and after many failed attempts, managed to coax a small, smoky fire to life in the little hearth, feeding it with dry twigs and branches gathered from the overgrown grounds. The battle against the damp was relentless. Every morning, her blanket was clammy to the touch, but the small fire, kept burning day and night, began to push back the chill. She ventured further, clearing a path to the old well in the courtyard, which gave cleaner water than the kitchen pump. She scrubbed the kitchen sink and a small section of the great wooden table. Her days were governed by the sun and the demands of her body. She rose at dawn, worked until her muscles ached, ate a simple meal of bread and cheese she'd bought in Bakewell, and fell into an exhausted sleep soon after dusk. The profound silence of the house was her only companion, but always at the edge of her thoughts was the north wing. Once she had established a small pocket of order, a habitable space she could call her own, the mystery of the sealed door began to pull at her more insistently. One morning, she took a candle and went to stand before it again. She ran her fingers over the rough wood, the cold iron of the bolts. She examined the wax-plugged keyhole. This was not the work of a moment. It was a deliberate, final act. Using the tip of a small knife from her sewing kit, she began to patiently chip away at the hardened wax. It was slow work, the brittle material flaking away in tiny, yellowed pieces. After an hour, the keyhole was clear. She peered through, but could see only darkness. Next, she turned her attention to the bolts. They were frozen with rust. She remembered Mrs. Gable showing her how to loosen a stiff hinge with oil. She had no proper oil, but in the pantry she found a forgotten tin of lard, rancid but still greasy. For 3 days, she worked a little of the lard into the mechanisms of the bolts, tapping them gently with a small log from her firewood pile, trying to break the bond of the rust. On the 4th day, she put her shoulder to the door and pushed one of the bolts. It resisted, then gave way with a deep, groaning screech that echoed through the hall. The second bolt was even more stubborn, but it too finally surrendered. Now, only the lock remained. She had no key. She studied the door again, her gaze falling on the hinges. They were on her side. They were large and strapped, but they were accessible. In a dusty outbuilding, she had found a small collection of rusted tools, a hammer, a chisel, and a heavy iron pry bar. She brought them to the door. This was work she did not know, but she approached it with the same methodical patience she applied to mending a tear. She placed the tip of the chisel against the top of the first hinge pin and struck it firmly with the hammer. The sound was deafening in the quiet house. Over and over she struck, until slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the pin began to rise. It took the better part of the morning to work all 3 pins free. Finally, using the pry bar for leverage, she pulled the heavy door away from its frame. It moved inward with a sigh of stale air. The smell that billowed out was not of rot, but of dust, dried lavender, and time itself. Holding her candle high, she stepped across the threshold. The rooms beyond were not empty. They were fully furnished, every piece draped in a white dust sheet, transforming the space into a landscape of silent, ghostly forms. She lifted the corner of one sheet. Beneath was a rosewood writing desk, its surface gleaming and unblemished. She moved through the suite, a parlor, a bedchamber, a small dressing room, and found everything preserved, as if the occupants had simply vanished one day. In the bedchamber, on the writing desk, was a locked tin deed box. The key was still in the lock. With trembling fingers, she turned it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were several stacks of gold sovereigns, a heavy, shining fortune. Beneath them was a sheaf of legal papers and a thick, sealed envelope. On the front of the envelope, in a neat, spidery hand, were the words, "To whoever finds this." She broke the seal. The letter was dated June 10th, 1832. It read, "My name is Elara Vance. I was a cousin to the Prescott family and have lived in this house as a companion for 30 years. My brother's debts have left me with nothing but this house, which will revert to the main family upon my death, and the contents of these rooms. I have been unwell for some time and do not expect to recover. I have no heir to whom I can leave my savings. Rather than let it be swallowed by the estate and the men who ruined my brother, I have sealed these rooms. I leave the contents, including the 200 gold sovereigns in this box, and the deed to the furniture herein, to the person who has need enough and wit enough to open this door. I hope you are a kinswoman. I hope this provides you a measure of the independence I never had. May it be a foundation for a better life." Mary sat down on a dust-sheeted chair, the letter in her hand, the gold coins gleaming in the candlelight. She was no longer a discarded niece, a penniless caretaker. She was Elara Vance's heir. The discovery of the sovereigns changed everything, Yet Mary's first actions were marked by the same quiet practicality that had governed her life thus far. She did not celebrate. She did not weep. She sat for a long time in the dusty silence of the north wing, the heavy gold coins cool in her palm, Ilara Vance's letter resting in her lap. The money was not an abstraction. It was a tool. It was roof slates and bags of lime, new window glass and seed for the garden. It was the means to transform this derelict house from a place of exile into a place of refuge. The next morning, she wrapped 3 of the gold sovereigns in a cloth, tucked them deep into her pocket, and walked the 7 miles to Bakewell. The walk felt different this time. She was not a supplicant arriving in a strange land, but a woman with purpose and resources. In the town, she sought out a stonemason whose name she had heard from the carter, a Mr. Hemlock. She found him in his yard, a man in his late 60s with hands like gnarled oak and eyes the color of the local stone he worked. He was a man of few words, and he listened to her without expression as she described the state of the roof at Corvin Hall. She spoke plainly, detailing the number of slipped slates she had counted and the areas where the damp was worst. He seemed surprised by her specificity. "It's a big job for a young woman alone," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am not alone," Mary replied calmly. "I am hiring you." She placed one of the sovereigns on a dusty workbench between them. The coin shone against the gray stone dust. It was a statement of intent. Mr. Hemlock picked it up, tested its weight, and looked at her with a new respect. "I'll need a cart for the slate," he said, "and my lad, to help with the ladders." "As you see fit," Mary said. "When can you begin?" He nodded slowly. "Monday week." Her next stop was for supplies: a sack of flour, salt, a side of bacon, candles, and a block of proper soap. She paid for them with small coins, guarding her larger secret. On her way out of town, she passed the bakery, the warm smell of fresh bread a painful reminder of her meager diet. The baker's wife, a plump, rosy-cheeked woman named Mrs. Finch, watched her pass with open curiosity. On her long walk back to Corvin Hall, her basket heavy on her arm, Mary felt a profound shift inside her. She was no longer merely surviving, she was building. The following Monday, Mr. Hemlock and his son arrived with a cart laden with new Welsh slate. The quiet of the hall was broken by the sound of their hammers, the scrape of their ladders against stone. The work was slow and methodical. Mary watched them, learning the rhythm of the craft. While they worked on the roof, she began her own restoration inside. She started naturally in the north wing. She pulled the dust sheets from the furniture, washed them in the courtyard well, and hung them to dry in the wind. She spent days polishing the beautiful rosewood and mahogany, the wood's deep luster slowly re-emerging from beneath its dusty film. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and carefully cleaned the delicate china she found in a sideboard. She learned the history of Ilara Vance through her possessions, her books on botany, her sewing box with its intricate needlework, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her linens. Each object was a testament to a life lived quietly and with care. As the weeks passed, a routine was established. Mr. Hemlock's steady hammering on the roof was the new heartbeat of the house. One afternoon, as Mary was airing out the newly cleaned bedding from the north wing, she saw a figure coming up the drive. It was Mrs. Finch from the bakery, carrying a cloth-covered basket. "I saw the work on the roof," she said, a little breathless from the walk. "Thought you might be in need of a proper loaf." She held out the basket, which contained a large, golden-crusted cottage loaf, still warm from the oven. Mary, taken aback by the unsolicited kindness, could only stammer her thanks. It's a lonely place, Mrs. Finch said, her eyes kind. A body needs bread. It was a simple transaction, but it felt like much more. It was the first thread of connection to the community, an acknowledgement that she was no longer invisible. She was the woman who was bringing Corvin Hall back to life. The rhythm of restoration settled over Corvin Hall, slow and steady as a changing season. With the main roof secured by Mr. Hemlock's patient labor, the house began to feel less like a ruin and more like a shelter. The relentless damp receded from the upper floors, and the air inside lost some of its graveyard chill. Mary paid Mr. Hemlock his due, and he left with a respectful nod, promising to return if she had need of his skills for the garden walls. His departure left a silence that felt different now, not empty but peaceful. The house was hers. Her focus shifted from the structure to the land around it. The kitchen garden, a large walled enclosure behind the house, was a wilderness of brambles, nettles, and stubborn, deep-rooted weeds. One evening, as she stood contemplating the daunting task, a young man appeared at the broken gate. It was Silas Croft's son, Thomas, a sturdy man in his early 20s with his father's quiet manner. "Father said you were making a go of this place," he said, gesturing to the tangled mess. "This was good soil once. My grandfather worked it for the old Prescotts." He looked at Mary's small handfork and the pile of weeds she had managed to clear. "That's a lifetime of work for one pair of hands." Mary straightened up, wiping her brow. "It is what I have." Thomas considered this for a moment. "I could bring my plow horse," he offered. "Turn it all over in a day, and I could help you work it, in exchange for a share of the vegetables." Mary looked at his calloused hands and honest face. She remembered the kindness of his father. "I would be grateful for the help," she said. And so, a new partnership was formed. Thomas Croft became a regular presence at the hall, his quiet industry transforming the garden. The air filled with the scent of freshly turned earth. He showed Mary how to plant in rows, how to test the soil, and which crops would do best in the Derbyshire climate. They worked in a comfortable silence, their shared labor a conversation in itself. Word of the changes at Corvin Hall spread through Aldwych. The vicar, Reverend Albright, a kindly man with a scholarly stoop, paid a formal call. He was astonished to be received not in a dusty, derelict room, but in the beautifully restored parlor of the north wing. Mary served him tea in Alara Vance's fine china, the sunlight from the clean windows glinting on the polished silver. "My dear Miss Prescott," he said, looking around in wonder, "you have wrought a miracle here." Mary simply smiled. "I had good foundations to build upon." Her acceptance into the community was not marked by a single event, but by a series of small, repeated gestures. Mrs. Finch began a weekly delivery of bread. Thomas Croft would often leave a basket of fresh eggs on her kitchen step. The blacksmith mended the hinge on her garden gate and refused payment beyond a cup of tea. People in the village began to call her by her name. They no longer saw the poor relation sent into exile. They saw the resourceful mistress of Corvin Hall. She lived frugally, but she was no longer poor. She used Alara's linens on her bed, ate from Alara's plates, and read Alara's books by the fire at night. She had moved her own quarters from the small servants' room into the warm, comfortable bedchamber of the north wing. It felt right. The wing was not just a source of funds. It was a home, left in trust for her by a woman she would never know. The house was slowly waking from its long slumber, its revival mirroring her own. The sounds of work, the smell of baking, the sight of smoke curling from a chimney, These small signs of life were a declaration. Corvan Hall was no longer a place of sorrow and neglect. It was a place of purpose, a living, breathing home, and it was hers. One crisp autumn evening, Mary sat in the parlor of the north wing, the room that had once been sealed away from the world. A fire of applewood crackled in the hearth, its clean, sweet smoke a welcome scent. The flames cast a warm, dancing light on the polished rosewood furniture and the spines of the books lining the shelves. The room was a sanctuary of order and peace, a world away from the derelict hall she had entered just a few months before. She had spent the day working with Thomas in the garden, harvesting the last of the potatoes and covering the tender herbs against the coming frost. Her hands were sore, and her back ached with the satisfying fatigue of physical labor. Now, in the quiet of the evening, she held a cup of hot tea, its warmth seeping into her fingers. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece above the fire. She had placed two objects there, side by side. One was her mother's silver locket, its surface now polished to a soft gleam. The other was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb, that she had found tucked away in a drawer of Alara Vance's writing desk. It was a tiny, perfect wren, its head cocked as if listening. The two objects, one a legacy of love from her own past, and the other a relic from a stranger's, seemed to belong together. They were talismans from two women who had, in their own ways, provided for her future. She thought of her uncle, Mr. Thorne. He had sent her here to be rid of her, to consign her to a slow, impoverished decline in a forgotten corner of the country. He had intended this house to be her prison, a symbol of her failure and dependence. He had seen only a liability, a decaying property that was a drain on the family estate. He had no imagination for what it could become. He could never have conceived that this place of ruin held the very means of her salvation. He had underestimated the house, and he had underestimated her. And she thought of Mrs. Gable, whose stern, practical kindness had been the true inheritance of her years in London. Start with one corner. Make it clean. That simple instruction had been the key to everything. It had taught her not to be overwhelmed by the scale of the decay, but to focus on the manageable task in front of her. It was how she had reclaimed the house, room by room, and it was how she had built this new life, day by patient day. The fire shifted, sending a shower of bright sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind whispered around the corners of the old house. It was a sound that might have once seemed menacing, but now it was just the voice of the weather, a natural rhythm in the peaceful quiet. She was 21 years old and had been sent here with nothing. She had been given a caretaker position meant as a final, dismissive charity. But in this house, she had found not an exile, but a home. She had found not just gold, but a purpose. She had found the kindness of a long-dead stranger and the quiet respect of a new community. Mary Prescott was no longer a shadow in someone else's house. She was the mistress of her own. The best and kindest charity she had ever received was the one meant to be her undoing. This story of a forgotten place and a resilient woman reminds us that value is often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right pair of eyes to see it. Corvan Hall was a burden to one man, a forgotten relic to a village. But to Mary, it was a foundation. Alara Vance's sealed legacy was not just the gold she left behind, but the hope she invested in the future, a belief that someone worthy would one day arrive. It's a testament to the idea that the most profound legacies are not always grand estates or titles, but sometimes a carefully preserved room, a set of practical skills, or a quiet act of faith in a stranger. The community of Aldwych did not rush to Mary with open arms and grand declarations. Theirs was a slower, more meaningful acceptance, built upon the evidence of her character. Mr. Hemlock's respect was earned not with her money, but with her clear-eyed assessment of the work needed. Mrs. Finch's gift of bread was an acknowledgement of a shared humanity, of the simple need for sustenance and warmth in a lonely place. Thomas Croft's offer of partnership was based on his recognition of her determination. Community, in its truest form, is often forged this way, not in words, but in shared work, in the quiet exchange of skills and surplus, in the mutual respect that grows from seeing another person's steady effort. It is the mason's hammer, the baker's loaf, the farmer's plow. Mary's strength was not in opposing her guardian or fighting her fate. It was in her quiet refusal to be defined by it. She accepted the terms of her exile but refused to accept the spirit of it. She took the derelict thing she was given, and using the skills she had been taught, she polished it until it shone. She reminds us that true independence is not the absence of need, but the ability to meet that need with one's own competence and courage. We invite you to continue this journey with us, to explore more stories of quiet strength and hidden value. If Mary's story resonated with you, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Share this story with someone who appreciates the beauty of patient restoration, both of houses and of lives. And we leave you with this question to ponder in the comments below. What is the sealed room in your own life or community? A neglected talent, an overlooked person, or a forgotten place? That might hold an unexpected treasure, just waiting for someone with the patience to open the door.